Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Eric Mack.
Thank you very much, and I thank the Oxford Libertarian Society, which I got the name for inviting me. I've been joking about the name, but I genuinely thank you for inviting me. So I'm not going to make use of any of these various devices here, and if you take a look at sort of the form in which my little talk is prepared, you'll see I'm not too wedded to highly technological things. I'm going to give a talk which may be a little bit too philosophical for some people and not philosophical enough for other people, so that probably means it's just right, and we'll see how that works. I'll talk for about 15 minutes, I understand, and then we can have some further discussion. Originally, I sent Dan a paper on the natural right of property, which I'm going to be giving up at the University of Manchester in a few days, but we've kind of decided that I should take a couple of steps back and speak more generally. So I'm going to talk about a type of defense of libertarian views. This should be, I hope, of interest to people who already think of themselves as libertarian in some sense, maybe people who don't already think of themselves as libertarian. But I want to talk about a particular type of approach to justifying roughly libertarian conclusions, and that's an approach which focuses on the notion of rights, a rights-oriented defense of libertarian conclusions. Now, as we're walking over here, we heard another possible defense, a sort of epistemic, Karl Popper, F.A. Hayek type of defense. And so I'm not saying that this is the only good way to defend certain sorts of libertarian conclusions. I'm inclined to think that some component of the sort of approach that I'm talking about has to be present. Most people who are thought of as pretty hardcore libertarian theorists have approached the question of what sort of political regime is justified and what such a political regime should do in terms of a doctrine of rights. So starting with the estimable Mr. Locke, and even before Locke, the wonderful levelers of the mid-17th century, wandering around here as well, through lots of 19th century figures and 20th century figures. Key libertarian theorists have focused in on this notion of rights. So I want to talk a little bit about this notion of rights, and then talk a little bit further about how one might go about justifying basic claims about people's moral rights. And you'll see that when it comes to the justification phase of the discussion, I'm going to be emphasizing that to really ground claims about human rights, natural human rights, one has to adopt, I think, a broader sort of moral individualism. An individualism which invokes the separate value and importance of each person's life. Each person's life or each person's well-being in itself is an ultimate value. That's the moral individualism that I'm talking about, in contrast to, say, the view that the value of a given person's well-being or the value of a given person's life is what it contributes to some larger, purportedly higher end. So I want to reject this notion of there being higher substantive ends which we have in common, that we all ought to spend our lives promoting or being devoted to, that there's some larger, higher, unifying end that a well-ordered society ought to be directed towards. That in a well-ordered society, people ought to direct themselves to this encompassing, comprehensive end, and if they're not willing to direct themselves toward that end, somebody else should make sure they're directed towards that end. So this notion of a type of moral individualism which asserts that for each person, his own well-being, his own flourishing, is what that person should be going for, in contrast to seeking some alleged higher end. That's the moral individualism that I think lies behind a reasonable affirmation of moral rights, especially natural rights. So that's a preview. Let me back up and then work through this in a certain particular way. And at certain points I'll be referring to sort of very well-known, maybe even hackneyed arguments in moral and political philosophy, but I think it'll help make the point. Okay. So when we're talking about rights as I'm envisioning them, and this doesn't include all special rights. Rights come as general rights, rights that everybody is thought of as having, absent maybe certain special conditions, and special rights which I might have simply because I've entered into some particular relationship with other people. So if somebody's made a promise to me, I may have a special right in the sense that I have a right that that particular person perform as has been promised. Other people don't have a right that this person perform in that way, and only the people who have promised to perform in that way have the obligation to respect this right. So I'm not talking about those sorts of special rights. I'm talking about general rights, and a perfectly good example of such a general right, an example which plays a large role in lots of libertarian discussion, is a right over one's own person. And what is a right over one's own person? It's nothing mysterious, as is sometimes alleged. It's like having a right over the watch. I have a right over the watch. What does that mean? I get to decide what happens to the watch. I can destroy it. I can feed it chicken soup. I can wind it, although I'm told it doesn't need winding. I can wear it or not wear it. To have a right over oneself is to have a right to dispose as one sees fit of the constituents which make up your person. That would be your body, your mental faculties, your talents perhaps should be put in there as well. Okay? The point of this is not to assert this right at this point, but to say that this right is a pretty reasonable candidate for being a general moral right, a right that every individual has, if anyone has, and it's a right that every other individual is correlatively obliged to respect. So I'm talking about these general rights. And just a few other comments about these rights, and again, this builds in a whole bunch of argumentation, which I'm not going to be giving, but the way to think about these rights, and the thing that's distinctive, I think, about general rights, is that they constitute moral constraints on how people can behave towards others. Moral restrictions is another phrase that's commonly used. The contrast is with claims that mandate that others pursue certain sorts of ends. So my rights, my basic, natural, general rights, and your basic, general, natural rights, simply require of others that they not treat you in certain ways. If we have a right of self-ownership, it's a right sort of not to trespass on or destroy what falls within the sphere of your person. Rights require of other people that they abstain from certain sorts of behavior towards you. These rights don't require that other people pursue any particular ends. So my rights are silent on the question of where other people should be going in their lives. They only speak to the issue of whether or not they can go there over my dead body. So that's what I have in mind by the idea of rights. One sort of recent, fairly recent, but now fairly recently deceased advocate of rights in this sense was Robert Nozick. Many of you may know something of his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. The first sentence of that book, I have it written down here, but it says something like, individuals have rights, and there are things that no person or groups can do to them without violating the rights. Okay? What I mean to convey here by just reiterating that line is the notion that rights stand as constraints upon other people's behavior. Your rights stand as constraints. So there are certain ways of getting to, there are certain ways by which other people can get to their goals. All of them are acceptable from the point of view of these natural rights, except ways of getting to the goals that are directly infringements of your own rights. Your rights establish a certain sphere within which you can do as you choose. So again, if it's a right of self-ownership, you can destroy yourself, you can nourish yourself, you can stand on your head, you can stand on one foot. All of those things not only are permissible for you, as you're not obligated to abstain from any of those actions, but also if you have a right, others may not interfere in certain ways to prevent you from doing as you choose. Others may pursue any goals they want, but they can't interfere. They can't get to those goals in ways that interfere with this protected sphere that you enjoy in virtue of your rights. That's to get clear on the notion of rights. Also said here that I think a very natural way to think of rights as restrictions is to also think of rights as fundamentally, and some people think that this is a type of revelation of what's wrong with rights, it's natural to think of rights as fundamentally matters of property or ownership. What do I have a natural right to? Well, what do I have a type of natural jurisdiction over? What do I have a natural ownership of? If you're, for instance, thinking in terms of oneself, one's own person, to have a right not to be interfered with in one's person is to have a type of natural moral jurisdiction over one's person. It's to have a type of property in oneself. And Locke, who I referred to, who we should remember was, although a fellow at this college, was also his fellowship was nullified or repealed because of his admirable support of the glorious, or earlier than his working for the sake of the glorious revolution. Locke spoke about people enjoying a type of self-propriety, and having a self-proprietorship in themselves. Okay? Again, I don't want to push this vocabulary too much, but the idea is that that one's rights establish a sphere, and within that sphere, one can do as one sees fit. Others are morally obligated to not to trespass upon that sphere. I should perhaps emphasize that in talking about these rights, I'm talking about moral rights, not legal rights. I'm not talking about positive rights that are established by law or custom. I'm talking instead about rights that if they exist, we ought to be able to provide some sort of a moral argument for their existence. So if you like, and again, critics of notions of rights sometimes think that this reveals some sort of great problem in a rights approach. Think of a couple of individuals just happen to be strangers who just happen to find themselves on the proverbial, we always say desert island. I don't know why it has to be a desert. But if it was a desert island, that would be a problem. Just they're on an island, right? No one else is there, right? Are there any restrictions, right, just in virtue of their being human beings, on how, moral restrictions on how one of those individuals may transact with the other? Two of us are on the island. So far we've been strangers, no particular positive relationships or contracts or agreements. One of us takes it into her head to slit the other's throat. Right? Is it a matter of moral indifference whether or not this occurs? Is there a case that the person who doesn't want his throat slit can make for describing the throat slitting as a wrong, as something which oughtn't to be done, as something that's impermissible? Well, to assert the sort of moral rights that I'm talking about is to assert that in such circumstances people can wrong one another, They can act contrary to how they're obligated to act. They can not constrain their behavior in the way that people are obligated to constrain their behavior. And then we have to search for some sort of an argument for this sort of claim about at least basic structural elements within natural morality. Okay? So clearly, throughout all this, I'm speaking as someone who's not going to accept various sorts of relativistic positions. And as we move along, it's be clear that I'm also rejecting a whole bunch of other moral views. Okay. I've emphasized the strength of, I've said something about the strength of rights, but let me add a little bit here. If I have a right, or if you have a right, let's say, over your own person, which other people would violate by killing you, one implication, obviously, of that is that if they go ahead and kill you, they've wronged you, right? From your grave, you can claim to have been wronged, or your friends can claim that you've been wronged. But there's another strong implication. You need a couple of other premises, I guess, to get there, from the claim that people have certain robust moral rights, and that is that one can use force or the threat of force to defend yourself against the violation of those rights. Okay, so rights are a bit of particularly heavy moral ammunition. There are lots of things I might say to people about how they should conduct their lives or not conduct their lives. I got it. If people don't oblige me by going along with my recommendations, I nevertheless have to let them go their own way. But if I'm saying to people, you have to refrain from a certain action because that would be a violation of my rights, or because it would be a violation of the rights of somebody else that I have an interest in, one close to implication, I say it needs a few extra premises, but most people draw this implication, is I may use force or the threat of force to get you to respect those rights. Okay. And this obviously quickly ties up with notions that are obviously part of political philosophy, because governments specialize in the use of force and the threat of force. So what we have here is a programmatic claim about what would be the measure of a morally acceptable government. The measure of a morally acceptable government would be that it uses what governments specialize in, namely the use of force and the threat of force, that it uses those processes only to protect people against the violation of their rights. Right? Protect people against the violations of their rights could mean a couple of things. It could mean actually defending people, right? Or it perhaps falls under the notion of the protection of rights to require that people who have violated rights to make restitution to their victims. Perhaps it also falls under the notion of protecting rights to retaliate against and to punish people who have violated rights. So there are the things that government does that seem to be acceptable on the basis of this notion of rights is use force or the threat of force to protect people, to defend people against the violation of rights, maybe to enforce restitution, perhaps also to punish violators of rights. It's an open, it's not an obvious, it's not totally obvious that that governments can exist without going beyond those limits. And there's a branch of libertarian theorists, especially, again, people who focus on the notion of rights and employ the notion of rights as the key material for their arguments. There's a branch of libertarian theorists who think that no government can avoid violating rights, or at least who think that it's extremely likely that any government will violate rights, and therefore they draw anarchistic conclusions from this. If the standard is rights and the demand for respect for rights, then on this view, all governments fail the test for legitimacy or moral permissibility. I don't want to pursue that question here, right? So we're not going to worry about that issue at all. I'm much more interested in talking here about what reasons one might give to affirm the existence of the sort of moral rights that I'm talking about. And I guess I kind of avoided the word natural, but in the good old days of the 17th century, people labeled the moral rights that I'm talking about as natural rights. I put that language in now because maybe that makes it more questionable. What could these natural rights be? Are they written in the heavens? Are they written in the clouds? How could there possibly be a reasonable basis for affirming these rights? Somebody starts out not particularly thinking that people possess these rights. What can be said to that person to make it reasonable for them to take this notion on board? Okay. Well, I said a way of getting at this is to look at views within which there really is no place for the idea of rights. See what the arguments for that sort of view is. See what the arguments are for positions in which there really isn't any place for the idea of rights. See what seems to be wrong with those arguments. See what seems to be the pivotal error within those arguments for moral worldviews which don't have a place for rights. And then by seeing what those errors are, maybe we get a hint of what is the basis for adopting a moral view that does give a salient position to the idea of rights. Okay, so now I'm going to do some stuff which is, in a way, quite hackneyed. And so if you're all familiar with this and find it terrible to go over it, I apologize. I hope it won't be, even if you're familiar with it, I hope it won't be terrible to go over it. Okay, so there's a certain sort of, remember I said that there's if one thinks that we are all, to put it slightly unfairly, born to serve some single unifying goal, like the goal of producing the greatest happiness for the greatest number, a goal that we should all share and all devote ourselves to, or like the goal of glorifying God, most glorifying God, a goal that is presented as something that everybody should share and everybody should contribute to the production of, or the goal of bringing mankind to the final triumphant culmination of human history. These are different types of goals that different types of moral theories have presented, but what they all, at least in their unmodified, bold form, present themselves as claims that there's a single goal shared by all rational beings, which everybody ought to be devoting their lives to the promotion of. It might not mean that you spend every moment of every day promoting that end. It might be that you are allowed to rest sometimes so that you can promote this goal even more on other occasions. There might be some secondary concessions to human frailty. We can't expect people to spend every moment of their lives devoted to this higher, transcendent, radiant end. But still, if you adopt any of those views, if you really think that there is such a common goal, and lots of people believe that there are, and I probably haven't given the most sophisticated versions of this common substantive goal that people are said to, in some sense, be born to serve. If you believe that, then it's nonsense to say, well, whether I live my life in support of that goal is something for me to decide. That's nonsensical, right? if we have this radiant end, which we all see a truly rational person would as much as possible spend their lives promoting, if you believe that, then it would be nonsensical for you to say, and by the way, it's up to me to decide whether I will pursue that goal. It's up to me to decide whether I'll devote my life to that. It would be in a world in which everybody accepted the existence of such a goal, it would probably be seen as a mark of insanity for somebody to say, I think I'm not obliged to sacrifice for that. And on top of that, I think other people are obliged to leave me be rather than make use of me for the production of this wonderful end. All of that would be nonsensical and insane if one accepted this very common notion that there is some, perhaps hard to identify, hard to specify, but nevertheless common rational end, that all human lives, insofar as they have a moral purpose, have the purpose of serving. Okay? So I want to suggest that it's this notion of a transcendent common end which lies behind, which if you accept, makes nonsense of the idea of asserting individual rights, and therefore one wants to have a look at what sort of argument can be given for the idea of this being a transcendent aim, and then we might detect some major characteristic problem in such an argument, and that will give us a hint of what one has to say, what one has to say in order to generate an argument for this opposite view, that rather than being insane and nonsensical, it makes sense to ascribe basic moral rights to people. Okay, so there's 3 or 4 little stages there. Try to do this relatively efficiently. Okay. So since of the goals that I mentioned, the one that is most common, because it seems to be less metaphysical and theological, the most common of these substantive ends that some moral theories tell us we all ought to spend our lives serving, the most common of those ends is the greatest good for the greatest number. Right? The most common of these ends is the idea that what gives moral purpose to people's lives is the extent to which they contribute to the general good. Let's not worry too much about how to define the general good, but the basic idea is that if you can forego some gain in your life in order to bring about a larger gain by whatever counts as gain in other people's lives, you ought to do so. If you can submit to some loss in your life in order to prevent a larger loss being incurred by somebody else, you ought to do so. Both of those types of actions would be ways of improving the general balance of aggregate good in the world over aggregate bad, and so you ought to engage in those sorts of actions. Right? So, although advocates of utilitarianism have also, I think, inconsistently often been friends of individualism and freedom, I think the core of the doctrine is this call, and I wanted to use it as an example of a doctrine that calls upon people all, as much as possible, to serve this general end, and that means to be prepared to impose losses on yourself for the sake of the general end, and it also means that it's at least permissible for other people to impose these losses on you. So this is preface to the following little series of stories. I quoted Nozick before, and Nozick in Anarchy, State, and Utopia actually follows Rawls in arguing in the following way against this type of utilitarian higher good, higher than the individual, right? Not higher than the earth necessarily, but higher than the individual. So according to both Rawls in the Theory of Justice and Nozick pretty much following him, if we ask why one ought to adopt the view that it makes sense, I'm just going to speak in terms of losses now, this is the way the argument is put. If you ask why is it rational for an individual to impose a loss on herself? Why is it better for an individual to impose a loss on herself? If doing so prevents somebody else from incurring a greater loss, right? So why is it rational for a person to sacrifice for the sake of saving somebody else from a greater loss? According to Rawls, according to Nozick, this is the argument that the utilitarian gives. Maybe this is not quite fair to utilitarian, but both of these esteemed guys say this is the argument the utilitarian gives. Imagine, I'm making up the names here now. So Sally has a little twinge in her tooth, a thing that indicates that probably she's going to have a toothache in a while. She has a little twinge in her tooth. And she knows, on the basis of this twinge, that if she goes to the dentist today, gets it drilled and so on, she'll incur 3 units of pain. And she also knows that if she waits around for a couple of months, she's going to have the tooth pulled. That'll be 10 units of pain. Nothing seems to us to be more obvious that it's rational for Sally to go to the dentist now, right? We consider, in fact, we say she's irrational if she doesn't go now. And it looks as though all we're talking about here is the idea that it's rational for a person to pursue their own good. It's rational for a person to recognize that pain is a subtractor from one's own good, and you want to have as little taken away from one's own good as possible, and that's why it's rational to go to the dentist, why it's rational for Sally to go to the dentist. Okay? But purportedly, the utilitarian argues in a different way. Purportedly, the utilitarian says, here's the reason why Sally should go to the dentist. Pain is bad, and less pain is less bad than more pain. Okay? Notice I didn't talk about being Sally's pain. I didn't talk about it being bad for Sally. Right? The proposition that is supposedly buried in our recognition that it's rational for Sally to go to the dentist, the proposition that's supposedly buried there, which has to be brought to light, is that Sally is rational to go to the dentist because less pain is less bad than more pain, period. Okay? If that's the case, imagine a slightly different situation. Right? Now it's Harry who feels the twinge, indicating that he has a rotten tooth coming along. But for some strange reason, we don't have to worry about the physiology of it. The way to prevent Harry having 10 units of pain a couple of months from now, when his tooth is totally rotten, the way to prevent that is for Sally to go to the dentist and get the 3 units of pain. Right? So that's the way in which Harry's 10 units of pain can be avoided. No other way is available. Utilitarian says, look, it's clearly rational for Sally to go to the dentist, incur the 3 units of pain, for the sake of preventing Harry from having the 10 units of pain. Why is it clearly rational? It's because Sally has precisely the same reason in this case to go to the dentist as she did in the first case. Because remember, purportedly, according to the utilitarian, the reason that Sally had to go to the dentist in the first case was less pain is less bad than more pain. Less pain is less bad than more pain applies equally well when Sally can incur the pain, right? When Sally has to incur the smaller amount of pain for the sake of Harry escaping the larger amount of pain. Okay? So purportedly, and this is not just Nozick, but Rawls, back at least several decades ago when he was writing Theory of Justice, this is the argument that the utilitarian depends upon. Why does the utilitarian depend on this argument? Because it looks at first, when we look at the Sally case, the first case that I gave you, it looks at, we might think, well, all that the rationality of Sally going to the dentist shows is that it makes sense for people to advance their own good and to minimize their own bad. But the utilitarian says, no, what makes it rational for Sally to act, even in that first case, is the more abstract and impersonal principle, less pain is less bad than more pain. If you accept that and comparable arguments for more benefit, more happiness, more pleasure is better than less, then what you see is that rationality, this is again according to the utilitarian, you see that what rationality requires is that everybody perform the actions, this is quick but roughly correct, that everybody perform the actions which will produce the best balance of benefit in the world to harm. Everybody ought to and is rationally bound to perform the actions which will produce the best balance of benefit in the world over harm. Okay? That is our common substantive end. And some people have even said, Mill, who is not at all an unsophisticated, not at all as silly and utilitarian as I'm suggesting here, as I'm talking about here, Mill, in some of the later sections of utilitarianism, suggests, well, what makes it possible for human beings to coordinate their behavior? What makes it possible for us to have a well-ordered society? Ultimately, that we have to have some common end that we're all devoted to serving. Okay? Let me just go one step further. Okay, a third case. Just like the second case, Sally can go to the dentist. She can incur 3 units of pain. By doing so, she saves Harry the 10 units of pain. Okay? But this time, Sally irrationally and immorally says, I'm not going. Right? You can understand her saying that. We could all imagine ourselves saying that. You know, she might say, oh, I'm just weak. I can't do the rational thing. Right? Although reason tells me I should incur these 3 units of pain, I can't get myself to do it. Under those circumstances, it looks as though if Harry or Harry's friends or Harry's government can, without too much cost, get Sally into the dentist's chair, then they ought to do that. Right? Once again, the costs to the world of Sally going to the dentist willingly is much less than the gains to the world of her going, and that's true, can be true in cases in which Sally is coerced to go. Right? Might be that the costs are less by coercing Sally, right? To talk Sally into going to the dentist, that's going to cause her an awful lot of anxiety. She's going to have that anxiety on top of the pain of going to the dentist. If you just grab hold of her and take her to the dentist, no anxiety, right? She's a little upset, but the social gains might be substantial. Okay. So according to Rawls and Nozick, this is the type of argument that on which the utilitarian case for there being a supreme good that we all ought to serve rests. It rests on this sort of argument. And against this argument, both Rawls and Nozick, in slightly different ways, but pretty similarly, say there's a problem here, and the problem is that this argument doesn't take seriously the separateness of persons. You've all heard this phrase, right? We can mean a couple of different things, okay? But I think the main thing that's conveyed by that, surely, sometimes they write as though the person who makes this argument thinks that both Sally and Harry are somehow parts of some larger organism, right? But the utilitarian argument doesn't depend upon that, right? What the utilitarian argument depends upon is the idea that the disvalue of the pain is impersonal. Sure. The utilitarian argument depends on the idea that, for instance, a world in which Sally undergoes 3 units of pain, but Harry is saved 10 units of pain, is a better world, full stop. Right? There's badness in pain, and therefore one wants just plain badness in pain, and therefore one wants to minimize pain. To speak about ignoring the separateness of persons is really to say, look, it's not only true that the pain occurs in Sally, right? The pain that actually you're recommending, and not in anyone else, but the badness of the pain is badness for Sally. Let me see if I can say that better. Somebody says, look, isn't the world in which the amount of pain that comes about, isn't the world in which that's minimized a better world? The correct response to that, which takes seriously the separateness of persons, is better for whom? It's a better world for Harry, in which Sally goes to the dentist in the second case. It's a better world for Harry, in which Sally is required to go to the dentist in the third case. But it's not a better world, period. It's a better world for Harry and a worse world for Sally. So the claim about separateness is the claim that what matters for any given individual is, roughly put, what happens in that individual's life. People can be so connected that what happens in another person's life also happens to me. I'm not denying that. Okay? But if we're talking about people who are fundamentally strangers, and Harry and Sally are depicted here, or I should have depicted them as fundamentally strangers, then what happens to Harry, Harry's fate, and Sally's fate are independent. Sally's well-being is not affected by the degree of Harry's well-being, or vice versa. Harry's being better off, as he is if Sally goes to the dentist, has no effect on Sally, right? Doesn't make Sally better off. Sally is worse off because of the process in which she has to go to the dentist to make Harry better off. We could introduce a lot of terminology that's used here, talking about the age and relativity of value and things of that sort. The crucial claim is that we were right in the very beginning when we said the reason it's rational for Sally to go to the dentist is that she has less pain in her life because of her going to the dentist. We were right to think that the reason it was rational for Sally to go to the dentist in the first case was that that's what most promotes Sally's well-being. Right? As soon as somebody says, well, but suppose somebody else's well-being is going to be promoted by Sally's going to the dentist, then unless there's some very special connection between Sally and that other person, right, we've got to say, well, you're off track. You're off track. What gives Sally good reason to go to the dentist is its congruence with her own correctly understood well-being. Okay. So I want to say that the crucial error, and the crucial error that's pointed to by invoking the separateness of persons, is to fail to recognize what we begin by believing when we first talked about Sally, that the rational end for each person is the fullest promotion of their own genuine well-being. So this is the moral individualism that I was talking about to begin with. what it really makes sense for people to do in their lives, what it really makes sense for each person to go for is, however we understand this ultimately, is to go for their life going as well as possible, is to go for their well-being, is to go for their flourishing. If you want to convince me that I ought to pursue a certain path in life, the way to convince me to do that is not by showing me that if I pursue this path, some end external to my existence will be achieved, the end that everyone else is going for. Right? The way to rationally convince me to go for something in my life is to show me how it conduces to my living well, given the particular facts about my existence. So, the theme here, the basic theme, is that what seems to be wrong with utilitarianism and other doctrines that tell people that they ought to sacrifice for the sake of some higher common end is simply that what makes it rational for anybody to go for any end is that their action will in some way be conducive to their own well-being, right? To their own well-being. This sounds perhaps like an egoist doctrine. It's not quite an egoist doctrine, even as I've said it so far, but you'll see further why it shouldn't be described as an egoist doctrine. Okay. So let's. It seems to me that if you go and you look back at libertarian arguments that invoke the idea of rights, in one form or another, behind the idea of rights is a more basic idea of the reasonableness of people pursuing their own individual good. So we've invoked Locke a couple of times. Locke says in the essay on human understanding that all happiness is good, but the particular part of happiness which is yours is what you really have reason to promote. And a slew of other libertarian, rights-oriented people. When Nozick talks about the separateness of persons, what he's explicitly talking about is rejecting the idea that people are bound to incur sacrifices on themselves for the sake of promoting the good of others. So there's this notion that rationality, as far as rationality points us to ends, tells us to discover what would genuinely be in our well-being and tells us then to go for it. Okay. Where does that get us in terms of political notions and notions of rights? Doesn't get us that far, okay? Essentially, if somebody says, look, I reject the idea that there is any sort of an end, like the greatest good for the greatest number, that I ought to direct my life towards. And I also reject that you can validly invoke such an idea to justify your interfering with me, right? So I also, not only does Sally say, I'm not going to go to the dentist. Sorry, Harry, right? Unless there's a side payment, I'm not going to the dentist. Not only does Sally say that, but Sally can say, if you invoke the idea of the general good, when you're dragging me off to the dentist, you're invoking an idea which is unsound. Because it's just not true that rationality requires people to serve this general good. But even that is not enough. Sally doesn't only want to say the people who drag her off to the dentist are irrational. Sally wants to say the people who drag her off to the dentist wrong her. The people who drag her off to the dentist violate her rights. So where does that come from? Okay? I want to suggest just briefly how we get on to that. Okay? One thing that putting back into place the idea that rationality in terms of ends consists of identifying and going for one's well-being, one thing that does is it tells us that people can't be obligated to give up their well-being for the sake of these supposedly higher ends. People can't be obligated. It's permissible for people to say, remember, as I said, it would be insane to say, if you believed in these sort of ends, it's permissible for people to say, well, you've talked a lot about this higher end, but I've decided to devote my life to my own well-being. That's permissible, if there really isn't a rational imperative to pursue the higher end. Okay? But suppose that morality simply grants that permissibility to people. It says to every one of us, you're not obliged yourself to step forward and incur costs for the sake of some purported higher end. We go, oh great, I'm not obliged myself to step forward to incur costs for the sake of that higher end. But I go, but you know, there are a lot of other people out there who would like to incur those costs on me for the sake of various ends, their own ends or some spurious higher end. I'm vulnerable to people imposing those costs upon me. It's only a delicately small relief to me to be told that I myself don't have to incur these costs. Right? But the relief to me is very slight as long as other people are not obligated themselves to avoid imposing those costs on me. If it's permissible for me to live my own life in my own chosen way, pursuing my conception of my well-being, if that's permissible, that permissibility will come to almost nothing unless others are obligated to let me live my own life in my own way. That permissibility to live my life in my own way will come to almost nothing unless others are constrained to permit me to live my own life. And if they're constrained, that means they're obligated. If they're obligated, that means I have the right. So the argument for people having rights is there's an argument for people being permitted to dispose of themselves and their persons as they see fit. The argument for people being permitted is that there isn't any higher end which instead people ought to serve. So people are permitted, but the point of people being permitted is that people are in some sense enabled to live their own lives in their own chosen way, but given their vulnerability to interference by other people, in order for this liberty or permission to come to anything, it has to be also true that other people are restricted from interfering with you living your own life in this way. So in common language that's used when people talk about rights, there's no point in your having the liberty to live your own life in your own chosen way, dispose of yourself as you see fit. Not exactly no point, there's hardly any point in your having that liberty without your also having the right that others not interfere with the liberty. And so if we have an argument for why morality should include the liberty, we also have an argument for why a well-formulated morality should include the right. Okay? Just want to give you a couple more sentences, a slightly different argument. Okay? I've said that underlying the idea of people having basic, natural, if you like, moral rights is the idea of the separate and ultimate importance of each person's well-being. Separate and ultimate means that for each person, his own well-being is, in some sense, the ultimate rational end of his existence. Suppose we really think about people in this way. Suppose we, and I think most of us do think about people in this way in our normal commonsensical lives. Suppose when we look around the room, we think that each person sitting here has in his or her own well-being that which it makes sense for her or him to go for in life. What sort of import does that plausibly have for the other people sitting at the table? Right? So I look at somebody and I think, I accept the position I've been arguing for. This being out there before me has rational ends of her own. Her own well-being is what it makes sense for her to go for in life. That is her rational purpose in life. Okay, now I ask, well, what significance does it have for me in reason in terms of my behavior towards that person? Seems to me that there are three basic answers that can be given. Someone can say, it has no significance. Here's a chair. A chair doesn't have rational ends of its own. Here's a thing we call a person, and the person, by hypothesis, has these rational ends of her own. But that doesn't make any difference in terms of my behavior. In terms of my behavior, I will use the chair when it suits my purposes. I will use the person when it suits my purposes. I might have to be more careful when I use the person. Okay? That answer, in effect, says there's no import to the fact that other people have rational ends of their own. Okay? Not too unfairly, I think we can label that the psychopath's answer. The idea that this seemingly extraordinary fact about some of the beings that we encounter, that they have in their own well-being rational ends of their own, right? The idea that that has no import for how I behave towards them seems very strange, and it does seem to be what goes on in some version of that goes on in psychopaths. What's the alternative to the psychopathic? We could probably have very fine-grained sense of what the alternatives are. But here are the two basic alternatives. Well, the fact that, and you'll see how this reflects the arguments we've been talking about, the fact that some other being has a rational end of its own, someone might say, means, well, the import of that is that I should take on those ends. I should add those ends to my ends. And because I'm a rational being with ends of my own, other people should take on my ends and should add my ends to their ends. And we're back to something like the utilitarian position. But that's an answer which seems to ignore the separateness of persons. It seems to ignore the point that the well-being of one individual is the good and rational end for that individual. The fact that you have a rational end doesn't make that end one of my rational ends. So what's left as a plausible story about the import for you of the fact that you see before you other beings like yourself that have in their own life and well-being rational ends of their own? It seems to me that the plausible reading of the import of that is you have to let those other beings live their own lives. You have to let them dispose of themselves as they see fit. You don't have to take on board their ends as your ends, but you have to do what we talked about rights respecters doing at the very beginning. You have to restrict your behavior towards them. You have to not interfere with their exercising their liberty to pursue their own life in their own way. And that, I think, is another way, related to the way I mostly talked about, in which the basic notion that each individual's life and well-being is something of ultimate and separate importance, that we have as many ultimate ends as we have persons, and that we're not all servants of some single comprehensive end. That's another way in which, starting from that premise, you get to the reasonable affirmation of rights. Good, thanks.